I've long thought is an interesting issue for Australia. China's rise as an economic powerhouse can't help but threaten America's sense of itself as the world's top nation. Even if Xi Jinping had been Mother Teresa, China's rise couldn't have but threatened America's view of itself in the same way that Germany's rise in the late 19th century couldn't but threaten Britain's view of itself as the global top nation. And we know where those rivalries ultimately led. Whereas Australia has never thought of itself as a global power. We tend to talk of ourselves as a middle ranking power. Economists talk of Australia as a small open economy, even though we're in a global thing, actually not that small as an economy. We're in the G20. We are about the 19th or 20th biggest economy in the world, even though we're a lot smaller than that in terms of population. But as you mentioned before, we also have a very different economic relationship with China. Except for Taiwan, we have the biggest trade surplus of any nation with China. They take 36% of our exports. That's 8.5% of our GDP. We have very different interests, and we are, of course, part of China's region, broadly defined. Should that be raising questions about the way Australians, including not just people who shape defence policy, but ordinary Australians, think about our interests and whether they might in some areas diverge from those of the United States rather than coinciding exactly with them?
In simple terms, to answer your question, I would say unequivocally yes. We as Australians really are at a point in our history where we really should be examining our place in the world, how we see ourselves and how we see ourselves into the future. And everybody will have their own opinions on and analyses of President Trump and what he's doing. But I think one of the things that the Trump regime should contribute is to prompt our thinking to be, what is our future really going to look like? Can we actually still rely heavily, as we have done and has been expressed, I would suggest, our own national security spending, which has been low, and some would say substantially lower than necessary for us to have any sort of sense of self-reliance in our own defence, the ability to stand up for ourselves when a need arises. Mr. Trump should prompt us to do some of that thinking a little bit more energetically, I would suggest. The time is right for us to do that.
And I completely agree with that. I mean, my interpretation, which I've shared with others in writing and commentaries, is that the election that the Americans had in November last year tells us something quite profound about the American people themselves. The fact that they would choose someone with all of Trump's characteristics, which they know about in a way that possibly they didn't know fully in 2016, tells us something, I think, incredibly profound about how the American people have changed, that they're not the same people who saved the world from fascism 80 years ago. They're not the same people who stared down Soviet communism over the following 45 years. They're not the same people on whose behalf Ronald Reagan implored Mr. Gorbachev to tear down that wall. They want walls built against foreign goods, foreign people, and foreign ideas. And you look at the way that Trump is so overtly disrespecting the US's traditional allies, not us so far, but certainly Japan and Korea, as he did in his first administration, and his European allies and Canada, the way he's disrespecting them, to me says we really need to be asking ourselves, as well as the people of those countries need to be asking themselves, not just can we rely on the US to help us defend ourselves if there were ever a need to, but do we actually want to be aligned as closely as Australia has been, and it would seem to me is increasingly trending towards? Do we want to be? And that does really raise some very serious questions about, including, as you just suggested, how much we need to spend on our own defence and how we need to organise.
I think that's absolutely true. I would agree with all of that. And some of the practical questions that flow from that, things like, how do we define what we spend on defence? And are those definitions that are traditionally used, like percentage of GDP, are they meaningful enough for us to end up in the right place? Is the Navy, for example, in its current incarnation, about which I have been quoted in the Financial Review recently as describing it as in a state of chronic and accelerating decay, and to put that in context, the Navy of today by my analysis of several aspects of it, which is to say how many ships in the fight, how much fight in each ship is weaker than it was when I was in command at sea in the 90s. And we won't get back to the 90s level of capability, relatively speaking, until about 2050, if all of today's plans go strictly as they forecast to do, which we have not seen this century so far. So we should have little confidence that our plans for the Navy in particular will go as planned, and therefore, what are we going to do about that? Does it require more money? Therefore, the question of what should our defence spending be? Therefore, the questions that flow from that are, should we indeed be building our Navy's vessels in Australia? And there's a wealth of discussion of that issue, especially in the face of, well, we don't build aircraft, why should we build ships? That's not a valid comparison by any measure in my view. But there are things that might appear to be more serious national interests for Australia that are not quite what they used to be some time ago in the changing nature of the world in which we live. And listening to our politicians using some fairly strident language along the lines of the most strategically threatened era since the 30s, the 1930s, and yet we plod along doing exactly as we always have done, which is the case. There is a mismatch between actions and the dialogue here that I think, even if it was only that we're saying one thing and doing something that doesn't match up with what we're saying, that should prompt us to have a serious consideration about what's actually happening here in Australia, and is this taking us to the place where we think is the best place to be heading to as a nation in this incredibly rapidly changing world, where you're an economist and you would understand this better than me, but I talk to a variety of people, one of whom is an eminent economist, who says to me, if you take purchasing power parity as the comparison, the Chinese economy has surpassed the American economy for some years as the largest economy on the planet.
So about 2017, yes.
Right. And so even if we don't accept that metric, and I'm not in a position to argue one way or the other, the inescapable fact is that on its current trajectory, even a slower trajectory of its economic growth than we have seen, it will still, one day soon, surpass by any measure,
of course,
the economy of America. And you would seem to agree that it already has.
Yeah. Well, of course, you would expect a nation of 1.4 billion people, ultimately to have a bigger economy than a nation of 330 million people, even if its per capita GDP was a third of the smaller country. And that's roughly the point that has been crossed on one measure 7 years ago and will be crossed on the other most commonly used one, that is at current exchange rates, at some point in the next 10 years, unless, and this isn't impossible, there were to be a big depreciation of China's currency. But that's probably a subject for another conversation. And I think you foreshadowed that there are a lot of other things to talk about in terms of how much Australia spends on defence, and importantly, as you hinted, how we spend it over what period of time. And I think that's something we can foreshadow will be another very interesting conversation in this series. So, Rowan, thank you for all of that wisdom and your insights, and look forward to having another conversation very shortly.
Thanks very much, Saul, and indeed I do too.